think that for a very long time there's been what I've called a kind of epistemological blind spot across social sciences and humanities, but really reflecting a broader kind of celebration of rationality in society. But what we've seen, I would say, over the past few decades is what we might call an affective turn, or turn to questions of affect across a variety of fields. And that is actually based on the insights that even if we've celebrated reason and rationality, a lot of human action is in fact driven by passion. You participate in politics because you care about something, because you feel passionately about something, not because you come to some rational kind of decision that that's the right thing to do. Well, some people have argued that we're now living in an era where it's more acceptable to speak about your emotions in public, to talk about how you feel, to talk about difficult things that have happened to you in your life, and that also there's a broader recognition of the importance of emotional intelligence, of the ability to read other people's emotions and feelings, and to understand how other people feel and be able to empathize with them. So I think there are some suggestions that there is this kind of shift. On the other hand, you could argue that people have always been emotional, and that it's just the way we talk about our emotions which has shifted. So one interesting example here is that the sociologist Norbert Elias has talked about the civilizing process, what he calls the civilizing process in Western societies. And what he argued is that for civilization to succeed, we have relied upon what he refers to as affect control mechanisms. That is to say that it's extremely important to actually control the passions of people. So for him, any activity like organized sports, boxing or football, anything like that is actually a way of channeling the kind of aggression that we feel in constructive ways, and then basically enabling us to get on with each other. And so I think that the role of emotion has always been kind of recognized in that sense, but also been understood as something that needed to be controlled and needed to be tamed. Well, I think that for me, as somebody who does research in this area, what's been very clear is that because of this emphasis on rationality and reason, which in journalism has translated into a huge emphasis on objectivity, because of that, we haven't really studied the role of emotion in the media. So I think there are some exceptions to that. For example, scholars of popular culture have actually taken quite seriously the role of emotion in popular culture narratives. And similarly, scholars of fan studies have been very interested in how fans of particular cult TV texts, for example, or fans of particular films or pop stars, how they actually have intense emotional engagement with the objects of their fandom. But in journalism, emotion has largely been viewed as a kind of bad object. It's been viewed as something that should be repressed, ignored, something that we shouldn't take seriously because it's seen as a sign of bad journalism. So anything that's been seen as emotional has also been seen as sensational and kind of contrasted to more serious or quality journalism, which is supposedly objective and unemotional. And so basically that's how it's tended to be seen in the field. But what this turn to questions around emotion, or what scholars have called the affective turn, facilitates is that it actually enables you to see what was previously invisible. And that is the fact that journalistic texts are driven in large part by emotional appeals to the audience, by telling what are often very emotional stories. And that, in a way, is central to how journalism helps us make sense of the world. I think that journalism has always been emotional, but that there are perhaps different prevailing forms of storytelling in each particular historical era. I think that at the moment there is a huge emphasis on telling personal stories as a way of actually getting audiences to relate to media content. But I'm not sure that that is something that's particularly new or particularly revolutionary. I think that storytelling has always been at the center of journalism. So if anything, what's changed now is the fact that scholars are actually using this vocabulary of emotion, actually talking about emotional storytelling and looking in detail at how do journalists tell stories that actually engage their audiences. For me, one of the really foundational figures has to be the sociologist Adi Hochschild, who looked at emotional labor. She looked at how airline stewardesses have to be smiley and happy all the time, and how debt collectors have to be kind of very tough and aggressive in their work. And she suggests that all of us are doing emotional labor all the time, and particularly in any professional roles where we actually face members of the public. And I think that's really useful for understanding journalistic work in particular. And I would say also for me as a journalism scholar, the sociology of emotion has been really, really central because of the insight of the sociology of emotion that actually emotions don't just reside in an individual. Emotions are, in a sense, potentially political because people can share their emotions by labeling them and articulating them in a public setting. And that, in turn, makes it possible for people to organize together around shared emotions. So that's a big insight, I think, of the sociology of emotion. And in the field of media and journalism, I have worked quite a bit in this area over the years, and so have a number of colleagues. So Mervi Panti is a colleague of mine who has done a lot of work on emotion in a range of different areas. But one of the things that really interests her is how journalists themselves experience emotions in their work. And I think what I've seen in the work of a lot of new PhD students is that that is a huge emerging area of work. That is to say, if we begin to take seriously the role of emotion in journalistic storytelling, then we also actually have to take seriously how journalists themselves are affected by their own emotions, by their own responses to the events that they're covering. Well, for me, it's sort of like an endless goldmine of opportunities for research. So there are 1,000 different things that I'm interested in studying. So I just want to give you 3 examples of areas that I think are important. First area has to do with looking at how different emotions operate in different contexts. So for example, there I've been particularly interested in anger, in coverage of politics. And I think anger is a really interesting kind of political emotion that enables people to articulate grievances in the public sphere. And I understand that there's also some very important work here in Colombia on forgiveness as another emotion. So I think we need to look at how different emotions do different kinds of work across different contexts. So that's the first area that I think is important. Another area that I think is actually really important is to use emotion as a way of understanding how journalists in different types of roles experience their work and their careers. So, for example, how is your emotional adaptation different if you're a freelance journalist or if you're working for a small local publication or website from what it's like if you're working for a big national prestige organization, and how do your feelings change as you move through time and you move through your career? So those are two of the areas that I think are very important to look at. And a final area has to do with how social media are actually changing forms of emotional expression in public and actually, I think, facilitating a more emotional public discourse. So those are just a few areas that I think are incredibly important to look at the moment. And there are actually many, many more. So for me, it opens up a whole huge new area of research questions. Well, I think for me, one of the big insights is what I've called the existence of a strategic ritual of emotionality. And that refers to the fact that actually telling emotional stories is central to journalistic practice. So we might have long assumed that journalism is all about sharing information and being objective, gathering quotes from sources and so on. And I would suggest that it is certainly all of that, but it's also about telling stories that audiences can connect to. And this is something that journalists do through strategically incorporating forms of emotional storytelling into their narratives. So for me, that's been something very important. And then I think also that it's been important for me to provide a more nuanced account of things like how anger operates as a political emotion. So how do different emotions operate in different ways in journalism? So I would say that those are some of the things that have interested me the most in what I found. Well, I think that as with any area of inquiry, your methods should relate closely to your research questions. So the thing you're trying to find out should determine what methods you use. And if anything, I would suggest that using as many methods as possible, or not to have any kind of fundamentalism about using particular methods, is really, really crucial. So in my own work, I've used a variety of methods. I've used methods like content analysis, discourse analysis, interviews, and ethnography. And I think that all of these kinds of methods are crucial, and in fact many, many more, so that you're able to triangulate your research findings and you're able to benefit from many different scientific approaches. I think one person cannot do all of this research on their own, and so as a researcher you have to decide what it is you want to find out and what is the best way to research that. But I don't think there's just one research method that's particularly useful for understanding this.